Good morning, everyone. As you know me, I'm Pallavi Adi. I'm the co-founder of Asian Pathfinders, along with Suhas Palshikar. Welcome to another edition of our Fireside Chats. Today's edition is actually something I'm really looking forward to, and I know Suhas is also, because it's on Indian elections that are coming up in a couple of states in India over this year, and we have a political scientist of eminence, Professor Suhas Palshikar, joining us today. And we have Sarthak Bagchi, who's the assistant professor at Ahmedabad University, as the moderator. So before we start the session and we give it to Sir, just a brief about Asian Pathfinders. As we were just having a discussion, it was born during 2020 pandemic. So we call one of the sessions that we hold is the Fireside Chats. Also, the other one that we hold is the dialogues. Fireside Chats are held every Saturday at 11 a.m. for 1 hour, where we invite an expert to come share their views on a specific topic, and we like to have a much more detailed discussion. We also have panel discussions every alternate Thursdays. Coincidentally, our moderator today was the speaker on one of our first panel discussion, our first dialogue. So we're glad to have Sarthak back. And those dialogues are more to have a much more interactive discussion between different experts as well as the participants. And we want to keep it as an informal forum. So we do encourage you to put your questions, comments in the chat section, and we'll take it after the speaker has made his remarks. So about our upcoming sessions, next Thursday, we have a session on India's relationship with its neighbors, where we are getting the neighbors' perspective. So we have someone coming from Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Bhutan to share their perspectives on how they see India's relationship with these countries. We are also planning a session on the current crisis in Myanmar, which will be next Saturday. We also are really glad to have the Swiss ambassador to India and Bhutan, Ambassador Dr. Ralph Heckner, who will be joining us on 27th of February. That registration link, Shreyas will put it in the chat section shortly. And also in the month of March, we have month-long sessions actually related to women-centric issues on the occasion of International Women's Day. So community guidelines, just for you, I think we all are mature individuals, professionals, so we don't need to be told, but just to go over it, we want you to express yourself. So please talk about the topics openly. I know we do put it on YouTube, but I think we all are mature individuals, so we can keep the discussions very professional. Also respect intellectual property. If you think there is something as a conflict of interest here, in the sense of you want to use some content, which the speaker or the moderator said today, so please reach out to them. It's an earnest request from our end to you. And just how do you get in touch with me and Shreyas? You can find us on social media. You can find Asian Pathfinders on social media. So that's there. And about today's session, so we have Dr. Suhas Palshikar, as I said at the start, as the speaker, and we have Sarthak Bagchi as the moderator. Sarthak is an assistant professor at the School of Arts and Sciences, Ahmedabad University. He teaches courses on democracy, Indian political processes, and Indian democratic transformation. Excuse me. His research is primarily focused on clientelism and patronage politics, comparative politics, Indian state politics, populism. The list is long, trust me. And his work is amazing, so do check it out. He also writes for Wire, Indian Express, Hindu, and he's also a political commentator in DTV India. He's worked as a journalist for NewsX, and before entering academics, he is also a doctoral researcher scholar at the Institute of Area Studies Leiden University in Netherlands. And for his doctoral dissertation, Sarthak has conducted a comparative study of clientelistic politics in the assembly elections of Bihar and Maharashtra. And he's trained as a political scientist from the University of Hyderabad, as well as he's a keen observer of electoral politics and party systems and state politics in India. So I think Sarthak is the right person to moderate today's session. Over to you, Sarthak.
Thank you so much, Pallavi, for that introduction. A very good morning to all of you who have joined us today for this very exciting fireside chat on India's upcoming state assembly elections organized by the Asian Pathfinders. Before beginning with today's session, I must thank Pallavi and Shreyas for the entire organization of this and putting together this very interesting platform for us to deliberate upon important issues week after week. So thank you so much, both of you. Assembly Elections and Political Outlook 2021. It is important for us to stress on the point that this discussion is taking place at an unprecedented time of turmoil or churning in the body politic of our republic. I use the word turmoil or churning as the present circumstances can be seen either as turmoil or churning depending on one's point of view. Looking at it from a statist perspective, hiding behind common hashtags, if I may say so, when sovereignty is threatened by seven-worded tweets and national security is alleged to have been compromised by innocuous protest manuals, the present circumstances can be seen as a great turmoil and a law and order problem, which needs to be dealt with brute force. If one were to look at it from a citizen's gaze of the duality of democracy and protest coexisting with each other and rather strengthening each other, adding value to each other, uh, as values of a progressive civic life, where freedom of expression and interliving happens instead of mere tolerant coexistence. The current trend in Indian politics can be seen as a great churning, a churning which is similar in scale to the era of post-Mandal politics or Ram Janmabhoomi movement, but not yet reaching, of course, the similar kind of lasting effects. As that which has been characterized as the second democratic upsurge or the silent revolution by some scholars. This churning is not only about citizens fighting for collective rights or group rights or fundamental freedoms, but it also shows their struggle for finding the negotiating space with the state. While we are witnessing one of the longest and by some extent also the strongest possible protest movement in independent India, organized by the farmers in opposition to the farm bills, we are also witness to what is being called the barricading of the idea of democracy. And our today's scholar has written about this in a editorial, recent editorial in the Indian Express. I was actually fascinated by this idea or this category of the barricading of the idea of democracy. And if one wants to explore this framework of barricading of the idea of democracy further, it becomes clear that the barricading is not just an overnight phenomenon or not just an overnight development. In a literal manner, yes, one can say that the act of barricading might have started at the Singhu and Tikri borders of Delhi's outer perimeter in the aftermath of the violence on 26 January by some sections of the protesting farmers who took out a tractor rally on the same day. However, going back in time, one can find glimpses of a barricading effect in the delegitimization of the anti-CA protests by labeling the protesters as anti-national. Going back even further, one can find glimpses of a barricading effect in the lynching and other similar acts of violence against people who were suspected of allegedly not conforming to certain expected behavioral cues as prescribed by a dominant religion with regards to their eating, their dressing, or perhaps even their marital life preferences. Going even further back in time, one can see glimpses of the barricading effect in a society which gives precedence to nationalism over freedom of expression. A society in which diversity is seen as inevitable reality at best and a hurdle in becoming a strong nation at worst. A society which considers citizens as customers who need to be loyal and bound by duty, and the state to be a service provider. A society in which there is a shift away from expansion of democracy to a narrow formalization of democracy, a shift away from openness and a shift away from diversity and mutual respect for others' way of life and thinking. All of these above glimpses are in fact presented in the findings of a study which links today's authors and today's speaker and today's topic, right, for the fireside chat. Elections are certainly important markers or signs of the health of any democracy. However, there is a significant amount of politics which goes on in between the elections too, which provide very credible indicators for the quality and health of any democracy. The shift towards majoritarianism under a strong dominant party at the center, emergence of the second dominant party system, limited yet important rise as well as resilience of regional parties, a move towards a cultural hegemony in political ideas, a specter of violence in at least two of the four states which are going to poll soon, namely West Bengal and Kerala, communal signaling and religious polarization, fissures in the center-state relations affecting the health of the federal structure, are some of the concerns which come to mind when one thinks of the upcoming assembly elections in India and the road ahead in 2021. Of course, there's the entire idea of suppression of democratic rights and what today's speaker also has labeled as suspension of politics during the entire pandemic time. Uh, and it is indeed great to have amongst us Professor Suhas Palshikar, who is perhaps the best person to give insights on some of these concerns and tell us more about the upcoming elections in India and political outlook in 2021. If I can introduce Professor Palshikar, it is always a good feeling to share the stage and in this case, share the screen with a scholar whose work one keenly follows and also gets inspired by. Professor Palshikar is one such scholar whose insightful writing and erudite scholarship has helped countless students of Indian politics like myself get a better understanding of the subject at hand. He is the chief editor of Lokniti's journal Studies in Indian Politics and is also the co-director of the Lokniti program at Center for Study of Developing Societies, New Delhi. At Lokniti CSDS, Professor Palshikar has been leading projects like the National Election Study, State of Democracy in South Asia, and Politics and Society Between Elections, which have helped us all in developing a more accurate and a nuanced understanding of politics in India. Till 2016, Professor Palshikar was also the professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Savitribai Phule Pune University. He was also a chief advisor for political science textbooks for NCRT from 2005 to 2012. Besides earning several prestigious international and national scholarships and fellowships, Professor Palshikar has been writing extensively in both English and Marathi in academic publications as well as in popular and print media. He's a regular contributor to the Indian Express and writes a column for Economic and Political Weekly on state politics since the 1990s. His writings on political processes in India have not only helped us gather a perspective of the national political developments in the post-Mandir, Mandal and market phase of Indian politics, but his informed analysis of regional political developments have also been very helpful for someone like me who has studied politics in Maharashtra. It therefore gives me great pleasure to invite Professor Suhas Palshikar to speak in this fireside chat today, which is titled India, Assembly Elections and Political Outlook 2021. Professor Palshikar, over to you.
Thank you, Sarthak, and thank you, Shreyas and Pallavi at the Asian Pathfinders, also their colleagues. It's indeed a great opportunity to speak to all of you here virtually, of course, who would be keen to know, probably in one sentence, namely what is going to happen in these elections. Sarthak has already contextualized the elections in the larger picture that is emerging in the country. Electoral politics is only a small slice of what is known as politics, what goes around in the name of politics. But at the same time, this small slice called electoral politics or competitive politics also, in a sense, drives many of the processes that take place, obtain in politics more generally. And that is why, while they seem sometimes to be diverging from each other, as he pointed out at the beginning, when he said that some churning is going on, some turmoil is happening, and here we are discussing calmly probably what is going to happen in Assam or what is going to happen in Kerala. So there might seem to be a kind of brutal divergence between the two, but there is also an organic relationship between the two because one feeds into the other. The churning would have some bearing on state elections, and electoral politics would definitely have a very important traction on what direction that churning takes place. But in any case, this morning we are not going to discuss that churning, that larger turmoil, the big questions of democracy in India, etc., but a very limited and more focused question about what does the scenario look like when you look at the 4 assembly elections that are going to take place during this year. As all of you know, because we have staggered assembly elections, every year is an important year between 2 parliamentary elections. And if this year is an important year, it is not because of any one state, because tell me a state which is not important, and then you will realize that all the 4 states actually have very important lessons for us and very intriguing questions for us. But let me begin with the big question that these 4 elections together will be posing before anyone who is interested in competitive politics or anyone who is interested in Indian politics more generally. Obviously, that question is to do with how will the BJP perform in these elections. Obviously, because BJP today is the important political force in the country, but also for those who are students of Indian politics, this is a very important question because since 2014, when the BJP first made a comeback in national elections and national politics, there has been this question about the BJP's limitations. And many people have pointed out repeatedly that there are certain limitations to the existence of the BJP as an all India political force. Sarthak mentioned this term. If I were not to be humble, I would say that I first used the term, namely the second dominant party system. But that has been challenged. The argument that India today witnesses a second dominant party system has also been questioned, mainly by Adam Ziegfeld more recently in India Review, where he points out to the limitations of the BJP. And one of the important limitations before the BJP is the East and the South, that the penetration and the depth of its influence has been more or less confined to the center, the West and the North. This was true of 2014. In 2019, the BJP, in a sense, made deep inroads in the East, winning Assam, winning Bihar, Lok Sabha, penetrating Odisha, and posing a challenge to Trinamool Congress in West Bengal. So I would argue that the BJP has already addressed one lacuna, one weakness, namely its presence in the eastern parts of the country. We will come back to this, of course, when we discuss West Bengal more carefully. In South, however, barring Karnataka, the BJP has had limitations so far. It has entered Telangana only very briefly now. It's not very strong in Andhra Pradesh yet. But there are 2 states which almost as if it were had a no entry signboard for the BJP, Tamil Nadu and Kerala. And these 2 are among the 4 states that are going to elections in this year. So the question would be, will the BJP truly become an all India party? Will it truly become the dominant party across the length and breadth of the country? And therefore, for the BJP, and I'm focusing on the BJP because, as I said, it's a dominant force, whether you like it or not. And therefore, what happens to the BJP, what happens to BJP's electoral fortunes is probably the most important central question for anyone on any side of the political spectrum. So what the BJP would want to do in this election would probably be to retain Assam, to take over West Bengal, and to create a toehold in both Kerala and Tamil Nadu. It is unlikely that even BJP, in its wildest dreams and ambitions, would be expecting to win Kerala and Tamil Nadu this year. If that happens by any coincidence, that would probably be the huge upset of this year. But let us go to the states first and then maybe come back to the big question once again. Since this is going to be a very short presentation on a very complex issue of 4 states and their elections, and Sarthak would vouch for this, that for each of these states, if we had one session, we could have still shortage of time. And here we are trying to pack them into one short presentation followed by a brief discussion. So what I'm going to do now in the next 5 minutes perhaps is to only raise probably one central issue for each of those states and come back to the larger question again about what is likely to happen in these elections and what would be the implications of those outcomes, leaving to you to ask further questions. Maybe we would have some time, I guess, for you to ask questions, and I'm sure those who belong to those states, either they belong to those states or those who are experts on individual states, would find my summary of their states very unjust, but that is where we can begin the conversation. So here goes, with Assam perhaps. So many questions can be asked about Assam, a very complicated state. Those who study the state may know that there are overlapping complications in this state. One simplistic division is Assamese versus Bengalis, but that is not true because there are Bengalis who have come from Bangladesh, Bengalis who have taken over Assami language and who are now known as Na-Assamiyas, and Bengalis who are Bengalis. There are Bengalis who are intellectuals in Assam, and there are Bengalis who are laborers in Assam as well. So all sorts of complications are home to Assam. But in this election, I would single out only one question as my favorite question, because that is where the turn in the tide of Assamese politics originally began, the Assam Gana Parishad. So probably the central question will not be whether the BJP makes retains power. In my view, it probably will retain power. It is not whether Congress will make a comeback. Incidentally, for those who follow Assam, they would know that last time Congress actually had slightly higher percentage of votes than the BJP got in assembly elections, but a miserable seat share. So Congress is very much alive there, true. Yet the Assam Gana Parishad, which ruled the state for some time, which is now aligned with the BJP or not aligned with the BJP, depending upon what statements of the AGP you look at. That is where the crux of these elections in Assam would remain. Because if the AGP were to disappear, if the AGP were to be crushed, then a new space would be created, a new space for a new definition of Assamiya identity. And once that is done, there would be a confrontation between Congress and the BJP to take over that space. And therefore, I think that this election would throw up the biggest challenge of its existence for the AGP, and at the same time, for the two larger parties, the All India parties, so to say, it would be an opportunity if the AGP were to recede in the background. West Bengal, I don't know which question to pick up, particularly because Sarthak is sitting there, and also Bengal has become much more complicated than it always was. Bengal politics has always been, during even left front rule, known for its cult of violence, as one may say, its street politics. It's a very rough politics, and Mamata Didi excelled in that politics in order to sidetrack the left front. And therefore, to pick a question from West Bengal would probably be a tough task. I scratched my head and finally came up with this very innocuous and probably comical looking question for West Bengal. And forgive me, Sarthak, for that comical question. The comical question is not how much the Congress and left alliance would do harm, but to whom it would hurt more. You know, when everyone is challenging the ruling party, our traditional political wisdom tells us that fragmentation of opposition helps the ruling party. So one might argue that the Congress-LF alliance would cut into anti-Trinamool vote and therefore save the day for the Trinamool Congress. But given the way they performed in the Lok Sabha elections, one wonders whether they would be entirely set aside, marginalized by the BJP, and because they are not helping Mamata and Trinamool Congress, will they hurt ultimately the Trinamool Congress? That is the question for West Bengal. Although West Bengal is also much more complicated because of the defections that are taking place and the question of incumbency, whether these defections are out of fear of incumbency or genuinely they are defections because the BJP is the rising power in West Bengal. Remember, before we move ahead, that in West Bengal, the BJP moved from 10% votes to 40% votes within a span of Assembly to Lok Sabha election, 3 years. This is huge by any standards. A party gaining something of this scale in a short span. Just a footnote to that, of course, is that in Lok Sabha elections, the competition is much more filtered and therefore all parties tend to get, that is to say, all major parties tend to get more votes in Lok Sabha and smaller parties tend to get more votes in the assembly election. So that is for West Bengal. Let us now move to the third state, Tamil Nadu. And we don't realize how complicated the politics of Tamil Nadu also is. For outsiders, it is a simplistic politics of two Dravid parties. But if you follow Tamil Nadu carefully, you will find that over the last 10 years, a number of smaller parties have emerged. And the two major Dravid parties, the DMK and the All India Anna DMK, have to keep making alliances with these smaller parties. There is a party of the Vanyas, there is the party of the Dalits, and so on and so forth. It is this context and the second context that Tamil Nadu poses before us, which is very tough, is this is the first election in Tamil Nadu after the departure of both vote gatherers, charismatic leaders, and stalwarts of politics of that state, Jayalalitha and Karunanidhi. In a sense, the handicaps therefore are common for both the parties. The parties, the AIADMK and the DMK, would be wanting to take over the legacy of these tall leaders, Jayalalitha in the case of Anna DMK and Karunanidhi in the case of DMK. In a sense, there is also a vacuum created by the departure of these two leaders. But still, for me, the central question for the state of Tamil Nadu would be the dilemma that BJP would be in, tactically speaking. The tactical dilemma for the BJP would be whether it should focus on seeking more space for itself. It has had always a presence of barely 3-4% in the state. So either it would want to expand this space for itself from, let's say, 3% to 10-12%, or should it give priority to keeping the DMK out of power in the state? Because DMK coming to power in the state can add to the overall strength of the opposition in Delhi and nationally. So for the BJP, this is a dilemma. Whether to facilitate the coming of the DMK and at the same time increase its own space, or to compromise its personal or party ambition and just ensure that DMK is out of power. The entry of Sasikala now will also be an important player in this complication that the state of Tamil Nadu is witnessing. Kerala. And remember, both Tamil Nadu and Kerala are among the most urbanized states of the country. And therefore, the questions and problems that these two states face are probably qualitatively different from the problems and questions that states like Assam, West Bengal, or other states from the east actually face. In Kerala, already the BJP has reached a very critical threshold of 10% votes. Its problem in Kerala, however, is that Kerala is far too diverse than the BJP would like it to be. There is 25% or roughly 25% Muslim presence, roughly 20% Christian presence, and Even among the Hindus, there is a deep division on the one hand between the Nayars and the Iravas on the other hand. It is this complication that the state of Kerala now poses, not just before the LDF and the UDF, but also for the BJP. The BJP has been tactical as always, and therefore has made efforts to win over the Irava community, not by itself, but by floating a different party. In Kerala, the followers of Narayan Guru have always had a faith in the organization called the SNDP, Shri Narayana Dharma Paripalana. Taking up some section of that Paripalana, the BJP helped float a party called the BJDS, Bharatiya Jana Dharma Sena. That is the name of the party, BJDS, though the party has recently split, etc. Surprisingly, in last parliamentary elections, the BJP also got fair share of support from the Christians as against the communists. So all sorts of complications can happen in God's own country as if it were. For me then, the challenge in Kerala, the single question in Kerala is not about the BJP really, but about its 40 years old bipolarity. This bipolarity of Kerala is now on the threshold of a breach. So far, it has not been breached. There has been a nice division between the LDF and the UDF continuously. All social forces have alternated between these two, but with Christians supporting BJP partly, Nayars supporting BJP in last election, and Irava splitting away from the communists and the left front, the stage is set for this breach in the bipolarity. So the $1 million question for Kerala would probably be, will that bipolarity be breached in an assembly of 140 seats? What happens if the BJP wins 5, 10, maybe seats? Suddenly the bipolarity would have been breached. So these are the 4 states that we are going to witness elections in. Structurally speaking, at least Tamil Nadu and Kerala are strictly bipolar, whereas in Assam and West Bengal, there is probably a 2.5 party system, if you want to call it that. A 2.5 party system simply indicates complications and possibilities of further fragmentation into a genuinely multi-party system. Coming back then to our original starting point and asking or looking at the larger scenario that these elections might place before us, I said that for the BJP, these are very important elections. Also because in Delhi, it has been cornered now, and therefore winning some of these states might give it respite. So let us quickly look at what are those winning points that the BJP possesses. And I'm generalizing. This is a very broad generalization, but I would say that BJP has at least 5 arrows in its bow. It has its victories generally base themselves on these 5 pillars. The 5 pillars are its talk of development and its appeal of development. There may be divisions and differences of opinion on whether it actually delivers development. The second attraction, and on which BJP's success is based, particularly in 2019, according to some arguments, is the welfare schemes and the advantages to different sections of the society flowing from those welfare schemes. Third is its mythical, invincible party machine or electoral machinery. It has money, it has also manpower, but it has also the brains to use both money and manpower. And therefore, it is said that its electoral machine is actually something very predominant. Fourth is the leadership factor, the Modi factor. and we at Lokniti have pointed out both in 2014 and 2019 how it actually was a critical factor. To my mind, the fifth factor is the most critical because it is ideological, and it is not just a factor on which BJP's electoral victories are based, but the factor itself then depends on BJP's electoral victories, Hindutva. So BJP appeals to the voters, sometimes directly, sometimes implicitly, on the basis of Hindutva. But its coming to power and its becoming stronger means that Hindutva would gain further ideologically, culturally, and politically in the country. These are the 5 factors. My suggestion to all the viewers and listeners would be therefore that in order to understand how these 4 elections are important, you simply have to look at each state to find out which of these factors might have a traction in a given state. Like, for example, I would argue that appeal of development and welfare schemes could be restricted to Assam and West Bengal. Even in West Bengal, Trinamool Congress can say that its record of delivering welfare measures is, if not better, at least a match to what the BJP does. But beyond these 2 states, development and welfare might not cut much ice in the southern states. Both have a good record of development. Tamil Nadu also has what scholars have pointed out as a record of welfare populism. Kerala is one of the better developed states, and therefore these might not have an appeal there. Party machine, the BJP has shown how it works in Assam. The BJP has shown how it can work in West Bengal. Yet, the BJP would be too dependent upon various affiliates rather than its own capacity in Kerala and West Bengal. However, the Modi factor and the Hindutva factor can be more common to all the states. Modi's appeal can extend, though it has not extended yet, to Tamil Nadu and West Bengal, to Kerala. Tamil Nadu particularly because, as I said earlier, in the absence of these 2 leaders, Karunanidhi and Jayalalitha, and particularly in the absence of a charismatic personality, there is a vacuum of personality leadership or personality-centered leadership in Tamil Nadu. The toughest state for the BJP, however, to appeal to on the basis of Modi factor, also on the basis of Hindutva probably, would be Kerala, because for Kerala, BJP would probably have to devise a developmentalist Hindutva, which they have not been able to do so far. Time will tell us, and I am not here to tell you what is likely to happen in these elections. So let me wrap up by just going to the final part in a couple of minutes. If you were to go back to these 4 states and also not lose the all India picture in your mind, what should you be looking at when you look at the 4 state elections? I would say, look at this, as I said about the AGP. What I said about the AGP actually applies to Trinamool as well, or the Dravid parties as well, namely, what is the future of state parties? If the BJP were to make inroads both in West Bengal and Tamil Nadu, I would argue that these elections would have probably opened up the last phase for the importance of state parties. And that is why these elections are important for state parties. Everywhere the BJP has entered, the state parties have gone into the background or have sort of taken a back seat. That might happen once the BJP emerges in these 2 states. So the first thing is future of state parties is at stake. The second thing which is at stake is the state specificity. When it went to Assam, the BJP had to devise a Hindutva which would appeal to the Assamese. Will the BJP be able to do that in West Bengal to create a Bengali version of Hindutva? Will that be possible in Tamil Nadu? Tamil Nadu, of course, has had this one year Hindu organization for a long time. The history is already there. Since Meenakshi Puram, actually, the history of Hindu consolidation has been there in Tamil Nadu. The Hindu Munnani has been there. Jayalalitha has had always a soft corner for Hindutva politics. It was in her regime that the Vinayaki Chaturthi ceremony almost became a monthly reminder of Hindutva power in Tamil Nadu. So the stage is set. Will that happen? But while that happens, will it be a South Indian Dravid Hindutva, or will it be a Hindutva of the pan-Indian variety? That is what I mean by state specificity. So in leadership or in other aspects, will there be state specificity or will there be a more pan-Indian uniformity is a tough question. Tamil Nadu and Kerala will pose before the BJP, and BJP taking over or creating a footprint in these states would mean that we would be losing further state specificity of politics, and politics would be one step closer to becoming pan-Indian. Finally, something that Sarthak mentioned initially, I have been arguing for past few years that electoral victories are one thing, but what the BJP actually has achieved is a kind of ideological cultural victory, what I have described as hegemony in the making. These elections would further decide whether that hegemony expands or is cut short, whether that hegemony is put in place, sort of put on the back burner. If the BJP were to win both Assam and West Bengal and make inroads in the south, there would be deepening of hegemony. And deepening of that hegemony would mean not just a question of style, but a question of menu and the question of discourse. India's political menu and political discourse suddenly changed in 2013. And now, almost a decade later, we are at a stage whether that change in the political menu and the political discourse will stabilize and expand or will receive a setback electorally at least. Elections in East and South, therefore, are not only elections about the East and the South. They are not just about one party, one state. They are also about these larger questions. I will stop here, hoping that there are some questions that we can address in the remainder of the time. So thank you all, and thank you, the Asian Pathfinders, once again.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. And I think that was really very precise and also very poignant. I mean, very important points that you have raised, and you have kind of summarized them very well for our audience. I actually had, I mean, we do have a lot of questions to start off with also. And I think some of the questions have already been taken care of in what you spoke. I just had this one question leading up to the difference between, say, West Bengal and if we, I mean, of course, they are not comparable, but again, just to understand it better in context of Tamil Nadu and let's say what happens in West Bengal. In West Bengal, we have seen that Mamata Banerjee has a very strong personality, and there is a very personalized leadership. And in fact, all her service delivery schemes and everything is connected to the chief minister's image and to the chief minister's brand, which is something very similar to the neighboring state of Bihar that we have seen Nitish Kumar. And he could also just manage to escape through in the last elections, right, in which Modi and Nitish Kumar worked together as a brand somehow. It was a difficult dialogue, but it still happened and managed to get the votes. And Mamata Banerjee has that kind of a personality-driven leadership. But you said that, rightly pointed out, that Lokniti has already suggested that Modi's brand image is much more larger, and his leadership is definitely miles ahead of other leaders. So at this point, is it actually favorable to have a strong leadership contest against Modi, or is it something like in Tamil Nadu where you say that there is a lack of a strong leadership, but then there are policies and other things and other issues, whether it is language and whether it is welfare or development or employment, other issues which combine together and tackle the BJP in where it is perhaps weaker. So which one is a more preferred kind of an engagement if one were to understand, kind of illustrate politics?
It's tough to answer because, there has never been a direct confrontation of Modi's image with any other image so far. Though all those efforts have sort of failed or haven't taken place at all. West Bengal is important for this reason that at least at the state level, you have an image of a leader, and therefore there would be as if it were a national Modi and a Bengali Modi. And I'm saying this deliberately because in terms of leadership styles, Bengalis would say that there is no difference between the two, probably. Though Mamata Didi's record of actually mingling with the masses is much more rich than Modi's record of mingling with the masses. Modi moves masses, but Mamata Didi, at least in her early career, has deeply rooted herself in the masses. Whether that rootedness stands her in good stead or not is something that West Bengal would tell us. What is good or bad, or what is preferable or not, is a matter of political exigencies. There is no ideal answer to this question whether there should be a leader versus leader election or leader versus issues elections. Our experience at least shows in India that leader versus issues election is a non-starter. There can be an election where you have issues versus issues or leader versus leader. But whenever there is a leader versus issues election, leader is likely to trump issues. Therefore, in Tamil Nadu, I said that if Modi were to fill the vacuum of leadership of which Tamil politics is so enamored of historically, then it is going to be tough for Dravid parties, both the Dravid parties, to make up for that, because they don't have that kind of leadership. They would pose a challenge in terms of Dravid identity, and therefore it won't be leaders versus issues, but leadership versus identity.
Right. Thank you. I think that also answers the first question that was put up by Shravan Budagiri, who asked that what happens in the absence of Jayalalitha and Karunanidhi, and I think this is quite answering that kind of a question. There's a question from Tanish Saxena, and he's asking that there's a big movement going all over India to collect funds for Ram Temple. Under the garb of it, RSS is reaching out to each and every household, and do you think such outreach will have an impact on the outcome of the elections? The Ram Temple, do you think that will be an issue in the upcoming election?
Not Ram Temple, but I understand the question. The question also touches upon this question of or issue of BJP's outreach. I'm not so sure that it is an outreach. I am afraid, you may call me cynical, but I am afraid that this is a clear effort to identify who is where. And therefore, this is actually not a question of outreach. As for Ram Temple, the Congress also says that we are in favor of Ram Temple. In a sense, the Congress wants to deflect the issue. But my answer to the question would be that the Ram Temple issue as itself is not so important in these states that are going to elections. Hindu identity can be turned into an important question by implication. West Bengal is probably likely to be the most susceptible state to this question of Hindu identity.
It is. In fact, being a border state is also helping in that kind of construction of the identity, and the othering is very amply.
There is a history to it, though that history was sort of camouflaged by the Bhadraloks taking over the left and therefore ruling through the left. Yeah. Now there would be a test when the left is sort of down. That identity question of Hindu identity would emerge, which is emerging in West Bengal.
Right. So the Bengali identity is being deconstructed now into the Hindu identity and other identities, which is what is happening. There's a question by Pallavi, who is asking that how will the departure of Tarun Gogoi affect Congress's prospects in this election in Assam? Recently, there was his demise recently happened, and do we see factionalization in the party affecting its prospects of giving a fight to BJP? And about Assam, and if I can add another question on Assam on that, the CAA, what role do you think the CAA will also play in Assam?
Gogoi question is in a sense easy to answer because Congress lost during his lifetime and under his leadership. His departure, therefore, is unlikely to have much sentimental effect for the consolidation of Congress vote. It would be more a function of how the Muslims consolidate behind the Congress or don't consolidate, how the Bodos get split, and how the Karbis get consolidated behind the Congress. It is more a social configuration rather than this sentimental feeling about Tarun Gogoi. In fact, our friends Vikas Tripathi and others, Dhruv, have written recently in the EPW about what Gogoi meant for the Congress, and not as an emotional symbol, but as a strategist, and how Congress was kind of an umbrella party under his leadership, etc. So you might like to look at that. On the CAA, yes, I would say that if I were not so enamored about the future of the AGP, I would have mentioned the CAA as the central question in the elections. You create mythologically, because these are times when mythologies have rich traction. So some of you might know this mythology about the Bhasmasur. Here is an Asur that you create and then it burns you down. CAA and NRC is such a Frankenstein, such an Asur, Bhasmasur, that the BJP has and AGP have gleefully created, and then they are now presiding over that Asur, but probably that Asur will burn them one day. Because it is not so simple as it seems to us outsiders, those who are not from Assam. It is a far more complicated question. Assam is probably the only state where you actually have camps of detention for those whose citizenship and nationality are in doubt. And therefore, this issue is touching a raw nerve in Assam. You can imagine a BJP chief minister arguing against NRC as it exists today in Assam. And then you can find out how important the issue can be. The BJP can only run away from that issue. It cannot take that issue heads on. If any party were to actually ask for an NRC in BJP, in Assam, the BJP would be running for cover.
Right. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a very important, because in Bengal we see the other side of CA which is happening. So we understand that policies and again the state specificities are very important, like you rightly mentioned. There's a question from Bhanu Joshi, and I think this also leads in a little to the national idea. Who wins elections after a while becomes an uninteresting question. He wants to invite you to reflect on the changing or transitioning preferences in society and the rise of the BJP. Specifically, he wants you to reflect on two views. First, there is a deep churning in society. Politics only makes it salient. And two, that it is the BJP machine that is explicitly changing preferences. So one view privileges societal changes like liberalization, elite shift, and search for identity. And the other view privileges role of a political party, which is new tech, and we see social media campaign, propaganda, etc. Which of the two do you think best explains what is happening in Indian society?
I think I cannot agree more with Bhanu. Yes, I entirely agree on this question, that finally, it is the churning that we should be looking at. And I would explain why then I talk of electoral politics still. But yes, I agree that over the last 10 years, and probably this began in 2011, so we can talk of 10 years, there has been a churning going on. A craving for leadership, a craving also for belonging and identity, and various effects of whatever economic growth we have had. So the structures are changing. People's locations in those structures are also changing, as a result of which there is a lot of uncertainty that surrounds us today. The BJP's electoral victory actually coincides at that moment, and therefore the BJP is in a position to both benefit from it and shape it. Now the question then, why do we discuss electoral politics? My answer to that, which I have already given some years ago also, is this, that yet this churning can be steered in a particular way by the BJP only if it were in control of state power. State power therefore makes a lot of difference And particularly for a party like the BJP, state power is critical. 100 years of Hindutva movement could not achieve what the state power of the BJP has been able to achieve in 100 days perhaps, and if not at 100 days, at least in past 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
I would say that first couple of years after the BJP came to power were sort of grouping years, and therefore I am putting it at 3-4 years. From 2017, the moment they won UP, to 2020, these are the 3.5 critical years that the BJP has harvested the fruits of state power, learned how to use that state power in the field of culture and social relations, not so much in economy. It is the regulational power of the state and the steering power of the state. Therefore, in the history of Indian democracy, for the first time, it has become crucially important who controls the state. And that is where the electoral politics come into the picture for now. Maybe after 5 years down the line, I can assure you who wins elections would be redundant, because whoever wins the elections, politics would have changed for a long duration, for next 25 years. So it is with that uh, position about the criticality of state power and elections, and at the same time the centrality of culture and attitudes in the churning that is happening in India, that I look at the current scenario.
Right, right. So while all this, we are also looking at the national, kind of a outlook. But I think there's an important question about the foreign relations and relation with India's immediate neighbors. And Shreyas is asking that, the Shreyas Deshmukh is asking that the polity in Assam, Tamil Nadu, and West Bengal also have an impact on India's neighborhood policies. How do you see that playing out, considering developments of India's relations with Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and other issues? We know about the border, and again, CA comes in, but also the kind of portrayal of certain nations as a typical way, in a typical manner that BJP does. So what it stands for here?
Yeah, there are two things. One is outcome of elections might not directly have a bearing on India's foreign policy as such. There would be certain constraints on the government of India if the elections go one way or the other, particularly as you said in East, in Assam and West Bengal, and in Tamil Nadu also. The trouble with our current foreign policy making is that it is far too driven by the internal ideological considerations and the delusion of India becoming a superpower. These are the two constraints in India's foreign policy currently. The delusion that we can truly become a superpower. India can become important because of its mass market. But beyond that, there would be various other players defining India's role in world politics. The other delusion is that as a sovereign country, if India moves in a certain direction, we are free to do that. We never are, we will never were, and therefore I would not comment on foreign policy lest somebody says that you are not an expert on foreign policy. But I would restrict my statement to this, that CAA or the elections in Tamil Nadu can potentially have an impact on our relations with neighbors. Whether that would actually affect our foreign policy universe or foreign policy view is a large question. It can have impact on our relations with Bangladesh on the one hand, and Myanmar also in a sense, and Sri Lanka on the other hand.
Right. And I think for those who are interested in the question of foreign policy, there's a very interesting article in the EPW recently which compares Nehruvian foreign policy with Modi's foreign policy. So please do have a look at that. I found that to be very interesting. I think Marianne Chaco, actually my colleague from Ahmedabad University, also has an interesting point to make about in case of Kerala. She's from Kerala, and saying that it is not so much the religious diversity in Kerala, but also what is most importantly, the economic and cultural prominence of Muslims and Christians. And this leads to the question perhaps that you also mentioned from the APU and Lokniti study about intermingling. and I mean, not only coexisting but also intermixing with other, and that brings the kind of diversity that brings, as against the kind of diversity that just tolerant coexistence leads to. And how does BJP handle these kind of uh, cultural and economic prominence of the others vis-a-vis something like in West Bengal or Assam, where it will be perhaps easier because they are in the border districts, and the other is in specific realms which is easily identifiable.
Sir, I also wanted to add a point to that. Sorry to interrupt you. I was also thinking of Nazi Germany and how the prominence of the Jews was used to create, insecurity among the German community. So I feel that in Kerala, it can also be this prominence of Christians and Muslims can also be used by the BJP for its Hindutva, the agenda.
But surely they would use it. I have no hesitation and doubt on that count that they would use it. And it would be a question of the resilience of local relationships on the one hand, and this new vision of the other that is being created on the other hand. That is going to be the tussle in the case of Kerala, obviously. But, Kerala is also important for the BJP as an image outside of Kerala. That look, it is here that a certain group of people are more prominent than those who belong. Whether it would have traction in Kerala is probably something that you would be best placed to tell me, because these communities, both Christian and Muslim communities, which have a prominence, also have had a long history of existence in Kerala. And as the word has been used earlier also, there has been a fair amount of intermingling among them. Breaching that probably would require at least one more electoral cycle, and only then the BJP can probably say that we have done it. So my sense is that the BJP is currently rather trying to split these communities as basic pillars of votes for a particular party or the other party, and then use its Hindutva in a very moderate way, what I call the developmentalist Hindutva that they would pose. That is probably the answer that one can give at the moment. But I agree entirely that in the sense of constructing narrative, Kerala gives BJP a very excellent handle. Actually, not because there have been communal strife, but because there has been no communal strife.
Right. Absolutely, I think that's a very fascinating way to understand how the communal angle can actually work. I just wanted to ask Pallavi, do we have time for one more question, Pallavi?
If it's okay with you and Sir, I'm fascinated by this discussion, so we can continue as long as you and Palshikar sir are okay.
Yeah, I only have to ask them to put them to Sir, so he's doing.
Bagchi, I had a classroom kind of question. Sir, you had mentioned 5 arrows, and while I was taking notes, I think I missed one of the arrows. It was talk and appeal of development, the welfare schemes,
Sure.
the leadership factor, and the Hindutva. But what was the 5th? There's something I missed.
Party machinery.
Oh, right. Okay.
That's a big one, I think, because that's what Manu also pointed out.
I mean, I don't subscribe to all the 5. What I did here was to simply say what people think are critical. And I suppose that no election can be explained only in terms of only one factor. You can only say that this factor was more important than the other here, and some other factor was important somewhere else, etc. But yes, these are the 5 factors. I mean, one can add more to this list, but I thought that these 5 would probably complete the electoral repertoire of the BJP.
And I think many times there can be a combination of these factors that play to to start new trends, like the defection is influenced by either leadership and also party machinery. We saw that happening in Maharashtra also, right, before the 2019 elections, that in Maharashtra also there was a mass exodus or shift.
I don't know whether Sarthak elections defections take place because of party machine and other things, or because of lure, or because of fear. Probably those who study defections will have to spend more time studying these defections in the first place. That have happened since the BJP came about. BJP historically, and any new party in a party system, when it becomes powerful, it will gravitate people towards it.
Right.
So that's one natural way of looking at it. But then the others are more specifically engineered defections for purposes of newspaper items in order to create an atmosphere. These people might get elected, might not get elected, but they would have created an atmosphere as if everyone is deserting Didi. That is the atmosphere that you create.
Which is called the Hawa.
And that is where leadership of Didi comes into the picture, that you then require someone like Sharad Pawar or Mamata Didi to fight back this discourse of creating a particular atmosphere.
Yeah, and I think her shifting her candidature to Nandigram, to the site of the is actually a very master stroke in that sense. I mean, again, I don't use master stroke because that has been often used, but
our language of analysis has been so much contaminated by media. One cannot but use certain stylistics that are popularized by the media.
Absolutely. It
is not a master stroke. Definitely not a master stroke. It is an important signal not to the BJP, but to her own dispirited cadres.
Absolutely. Exactly. There's a question from Nandini Puri, if I can ask that. In the introduction, you had mentioned staggered elections, and there are two questions, in fact, in that. Is it so simple and feasible to have concurrent state assembly elections of different states with Lok Sabha? And second is, how can early elections in different states to be called to make it concurrent with Lok Sabha by cutting short the tenure as stated in different reports? Is it not a violation of principles of constitution, and is it not an interference in the working of the state government? So this is perhaps also leading to the idea of one nation, one election, that kind of
I have written in the EPW on this, carefully reading the Niti Aayog paper, and I thought that the Niti Aayog paper practically says forget about the constitution, and then you can have one nation, one elections. But to give the answer here for this audience, one nation, one election, or simultaneous elections, to have a better word perhaps, would require in the first place a great deal of persuasion with state governments, which the BJP has not been able to do. It has not been able to even ask its own chief ministers to resign in order to have simultaneous elections. The other thing is, and that is what the question rightly points out, the cycle is bound to be different, because suppose you have common elections today by one way or the other, and then tomorrow there is a no confidence motion, the state government falls, nobody can form a government. What do you do? The Niti Aayog paper suggests that in such a case, the same government will continue, or otherwise it suggests that there should be a constructive vote of no confidence, meaning that a legislature cannot pass a no confidence motion unless a legislature can throw up a majority government. Now, this is clearly in violation of parliamentary system as much as I understand it, and therefore I have been saying that this simultaneous election platform violates A, federal structure, B, it violates the parliamentary structure. If we are okay with violation of both these, then you can create any system that you want. So I have been opposed to simultaneous elections, not because it has come from the BJP, because this has not come from the BJP. It originally came even from Indira Gandhi. In 1980s, the Election Commission actually had brief mention in its report that it is better if there are simultaneous elections. So this is not a very brilliantly new idea altogether, but at least an idea newly presented. I am not opposed to that idea because it is newly presented or whatever. I am saying that if we agree that these two principles can be set aside, federalism and parliamentary system, then you can think of any system of elections that you want. Till then you can't.
Right, right. I think we have covered a lot of questions, and I think we have covered a very fair amount of issues also. I think probably, and we have touched upon all aspects, probably almost all aspects, which could actually help us in understanding and looking out for watching out these four very important state elections, and also the nature of center-state relations, and the nature of the role of leadership, party machinery, and also the political culture between elections. And I think. I would now like to hand it back to Pallavi, and thank you, Professor Palshikar, for this very enriching and very insightful engagement, and also for bringing out such clarity that you always do with your writings and lectures. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Sarthak, and thank you everyone. Before Pallavi takes over, the attempt here was not to teach you, not to tell you what is happening in these elections, but to suggest that these are possibly pathways for analyzing the coming elections. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I have one question because I forgot to put that in the chat, and I have the.
This is the right of being the host and ask the question.
Last question, sir, because I think these elections are also seen as possibly setting the stage for the big elections next year. UP, Punjab, obviously, and especially with the farmers' protest. How do you think it's setting the stage? And if then, how do you see it as setting the stage, especially for UP and Punjab?
Again, as far as what the word media word that Sarthak used, Hawa is concerned, these elections definitely matter. But so far, our states more or less are becoming so insulated in their politics that it doesn't directly matter. Even if, let's say, Hindutva plank fails in these states, that is not that Hindutva plank will fail in UP next year. And that is why I don't think that these elections would have a direct bearing. The word you used is probably correct. They would set the stage, so to say. Set the stage in this sense that the Chief Minister of UP could then tell the national leadership that you can't win the elections, so let me win the elections on my own. So it would actually add to the state specificity of UP and the power of the UP leadership if these elections were to be a setback for the BJP. If the BJP wins these elections, the national leadership would go back to Lucknow and tell the Chief Minister of UP, we know how to win elections, so please give us some freedom. So that would, in a sense, create some kind of a conversation within the BJP, a party where conversation has practically stopped. So these elections are important in that sense.
Thank you.
The scenario that you have just mentioned also brings to light the comparison of out of the frying and into the fire for both cases. Sorry to interrupt. Sorry. Yes, Pallavi, please.
No worries, Sarthak. Thank you, Sarthak. And sir, thank you for answering the question. I think I got the option because I'm the host, so I can do that. And again, thank you so much to Sarthak for keeping this a very, very engaging discussion. It's always a pleasure to have you back, Sarthak. So yeah, and thank you for agreeing to come back again. And definitely to Palshikar sir, because he not only gave his time and his knowledge today, but it was a very, very fascinating insight into Indian politics, and it is great to always hear and read your work. And obviously to everyone who kept the discussion so engaging, the participants, so thank you so much again. And like I said, we have some interesting sessions coming up, so do check out our social media pages for those. So thank you everyone, and have a good weekend. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarthak.
Bye. Thank you, Shreyas. Thank you, Pallavi. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.